The situation in the Middle East has changed dramatically. Right now, Qatar and the United Arab Emirates have decided to act independently from the United States of America and have put forward their own demands to Iran, completely disregarding Donald Trump's deal with Tehran. Qatar is playing its own game altogether, and it increasingly looks like Doha is becoming the key player in the region, the one that could have drawn the United States into a war against Iran. And in this episode, we'll discuss why I'm making this particular statement. Although it should be admitted right away that such a position by Qatar could become extremely advantageous for Israel. At the same time, the Emirates are demanding that the US force Iran to pay financial compensation for all the damage caused. They say that it is Iran that should pay its neighbors for its strikes, not the world that should create some kind of $300 billion investment fund for the restoration of Iran. But the game is getting much more interesting because Turkey also wants to take its place. Donald Trump announced that the US will finally approve the sale of engines for F-35 fighter jets to Ankara, something the United States has not done for many years. Today, the guest, US Secretary Marco Rubio, was convincing the monarchies of the Persian Gulf that the US had won the war against Iran, and in particular, everything is still guaranteed by America. As a result, the US and the Persian Gulf countries published a joint statement today following the meeting of the Arab States Cooperation Council. And in it, it is stated that the Arab states demand from Iran essentially the same things as Israel does. This includes the elimination not only of the nuclear program, but also the missile program, as well as complete disarmament and the cessation of Tehran's funding of all its proxy forces in the region, such as Hezbollah. And now Israel is saying that in such a scenario, it is ready to withdraw its troops from Lebanon. And the Arabs also demanded that the United States ensure that Iran complies with all their demands. Otherwise, they will not allocate money for that very investment fund for Iran, worth $300 billion, which Donald Trump promised in his Memorandum of Understanding with Iran. But there is more. There is another problem that will be very difficult for Trump to solve. The question is how to lift all the sanctions against Iran that have been imposed for 40 years. And experts are certain that it will be extremely difficult to do this purely from a procedural standpoint. My name is Alexei Pechi. It's June 25th. Let's summarize the situation in the Middle East at this moment together. But before we begin, I ask you to subscribe to the channel, give a like, and leave any comment under this episode. So, US Secretary of State Marco Rubio tried today to convince the monarchs of the Persian Gulf countries that the US deal with Iran is beneficial for everyone. But the meeting, not everyone agrees with this. First and foremost, Qatar and the United Arab Emirates do not agree. The day before, Marco Rubio met in Abu Dhabi with the leadership of the Emirates. And during the negotiations, the US Secretary of State confirmed that America intends to continue ensuring the security of the Arabian country, which has suffered the most from Iranian attacks since the beginning of the war in the Middle East. Efforts to ensure full and safe transit through the Hormuz Strait were also at the center of the agenda. And after that, Marco Rubio went to Kuwait and Bahrain, which also faced a barrage of Iranian missiles and drones. And as stated by the US State Department, the goal of Marco Rubio's Middle Eastern visit was also to address the barrage of Iranian missiles and drones, to inform allies about the benefits of the agreement with Iran, which was concluded on June 17. However, Marco Rubio's mission turned out to be quite difficult, and he had to explain himself to his allies very often. Rubio found that in Abu Dhabi, they began listing their complaints about Donald Trump's deal. During negotiations with the Secretary of State, the Emirates made it clear to him and began listing complaints about Donald Trump's deal. He must compensate the Emirates for the damage caused during the war, which is estimated at billions of dollars. First of all, this is direct damage, which includes the destruction of civilian facilities, hotels, airports, ports, and much more. Secondly, this is indirect damage that was caused to the United Arab Emirates by the halt of maritime trade through the Hormuz Strait and more. Well, for example, investments in Dubai itself decreased a bit because for a certain period people thought it was becoming unsafe there. The ports of Dubai and Abu Dhabi are major trade hubs that also suffered huge losses amid the regional conflict. And the Emirates kind of made it clear that if Donald Trump thinks he can just end the war like that, open the Hormuz Strait and declare it a victory, then he is very much mistaken. because in Abu Dhabi they were counting their losses throughout the entire war. And now the Emirates are demanding not just to punish Iran, they are also demanding that Iran compensate them for all the losses they have suffered. And the Emirates say, we don't quite understand what kind of peace deal is this, where Iran doesn't bear any responsibility at all. For the fact that your partners, I mean the partners of the United States of America, have suffered such huge losses? Moreover, the Emirates demand that Trump get Iran to agree to terms in the peace agreement that would include a commitment from Iran not to attack its neighbors and not to obstruct the passage of ships through the Strait of Hormuz in the future. This provision must be secured at the level of the UN Security Council. If Iran violates this rule and, for example, attacks someone or starts charging fees for passage through the Strait of Hormuz, then a clearly defined sanctions mechanism should be triggered against it. Not at the level of the United States, but at the level of the UN Security Council. And if that doesn't happen, then the Emirates say that Donald Trump's deal isn't worth a dime. If the United States does not agree to such demands from the Emirates, they are ready to start taking action against Iran without Washington's involvement. In addition, the United Arab Emirates and other countries in the region demand that the peace agreement include the destruction of Iran's missile program. In addition, the US's Middle Eastern allies would like Tehran to stop sponsoring its proxy forces in the Middle East, which include Hamas, Hezbollah, the Yemeni Houthis, and Shiite groups in Iraq. Here, by the way, the interests of the Arab countries and Israel coincide. Both sides want Iran to stop funding these terrorist cells throughout the region. But here the interests of the Arab monarchies and Israel coincide not because the Arabs have suddenly grown very fond of Israel. No, it just became known that amid the war, the Iranian Revolutionary Guard Corps has formed special underground cells in Iraq to carry out attacks on Arabian states. And these Arabian states are demanding from Dima that he make sure Iran doesn't do this. Otherwise, they say, look, we're about to give them an investment fund and they won't spend this money on rebuilding the economy, but instead they'll spend it on their weapons. Plus, they'll use it to finance these underground cells, which will later attack both the Arabian monarchies and Israel. It is also reported that some Arab leaders are concerned about the memorandum clause regarding the creation of this very reconstruction and economic fund for Iran, amounting to $300 billion, which is intended to restore Iran after prolonged fighting. And now in the Emirates, they're saying, stop, listen. So we're all chipping in money, and I want to emphasize it's us who will be contributing to this fund. We're chipping in money to rebuild Iran, but who's going to rebuild us? We've also been hit, you know. Let me remind you of these scenes. Destroyed airports, for example, in subsidiary strikes on Dima Torzok, regular ones, and so on. And so, as Arab countries believe, the resources of this investment fund could be used by Iranians to build up their military power. But on the other hand, doesn't Iran want to pay for the destruction in neighboring countries? It's easy to demand compensation for yourself, but not want to take responsibility for anything. As a result, today in the capital of Bahrain, Manama, a meeting of the council was held, where Marco Rubio assured the key countries of the region that Trump's deal is beneficial for them as well. And so the Arab states managed to push through their conditions. And so the final statement of the meeting of the Cooperation Council of Arab States includes the following points. Next, I will list them and we will analyze them as we go. The ministers emphasized the need to maintain unity in the talks on Iran to prevent Iran from developing or acquiring nuclear weapons. The ministers emphasized that lasting peace requires addressing other issues as well, including Iran's ballistic missile and drone programs and proxy groups in the region. This is very important that the Arab monarchies have essentially confirmed this point. This is what Israel was striving for, but something that Donald Trump completely missed in his memorandum of understanding with subtitles. Let's move on. The ministers emphasized the importance of opening the armored strait, but rejected any tariffs, fees, or attempts to establish control over the strait. This is what Iran, together with Oman, is now trying to accomplish. But, by the way, at this meeting, Oman stated that no, we believe these are international waters, and for example, we do not want to impose any fees there. but Oman is being very cunning. Let me remind you that at the beginning, in the context of the US and Israel against Iran, Oman seemed to be within the orbit of the United States of America, but then it started to pursue its own intrigues and negotiations together with Tehran and Dimatorzok. Oman seemed to be within the orbit of the United States of America, but then it started to pursue its own intrigues and negotiations together with Tehran. Now the Iranians and Omanis are also playing their own separate game. Let's move on. The ministers emphasized that any trade and investment relations with Iran are conditional and can be cancelled. This is the point about that $300 billion investment fund. And the Arabs made it clear that if Iran acts up, no one will invest a single penny there. So let's move on. What are they saying? These investment relations depend on Iran complying with the provisions of the memorandum and the final agreement, stopping its destabilizing activities, and creating the necessary conditions for economic cooperation. The ministers agreed to continue cooperating with the Syrian government and to provide assistance in addressing key issues such as combating terrorism, restoring basic services, improving the investment climate, and creating conditions for the voluntary return of refugees and internally displaced persons. When it comes to Syria, it's a whole separate story, because right now everything is shaping up so that the responsibility for solving the Hezbollah issue in terms of involvement falls on the Syrian authorities, but we'll get to that a bit later. The ministers reaffirmed their full commitment to the sovereignty, security, stability, and territorial integrity of Lebanon. In this regard, they welcomed the ongoing bilateral negotiations between Israel and Lebanon, mediated by the United States, aimed at creating conditions for a long-term peace agreement and a security agreement between the two countries. The ministers called for the complete disarmament of all proxy groups in Lebanon, primarily, of course, Hezbollah, and for the restoration of the Lebanese state's monopoly on the use of force. This is also a very important point, because it emphasizes that the entire region absolutely supports Israel's idea, because Israel says that there will be no Hezbollah, no proxy groups, only the Lebanese army. That way there won't be problems and we won't fight. And Israel says directly that we have no issues with Lebanon as a state, zero issues with the Lebanese people, and only one issue with the Lebanese authorities. Remove Hezbollah, and then there will be no issues at all. Let's move on. The ministers, meaning the ministers of the Gulf countries, confirmed their support for Donald Trump's comprehensive plan to end the conflict in the Gaza Strip. The ministers gave a positive assessment of President Trump's statement that the US is against the annexation of the West Bank. And they emphasized that progress in the reconstruction of Gaza and reforms of the Palestinian administration will create conditions for establishing a reliable path to Palestinian self-determination and statehood. На очень долгую перспективу. This is a long-term view. The ministers confirmed no one will be forced to leave Gaza, and those who leave can return freely. So, in fact, very many points coincide with what Israel is expecting. For example, all countries demand the disarmament and cessation of funding for Iran's terrorist cells, such as Hezbollah, Hamas, the Yemeni Houthis, and Shiite groups in Iraq. And today, Israel allowed for the possibility of withdrawing troops from Lebanon if Hezbollah is truly disbanded and disarmed. But to get ahead of myself, I'll say that the story with Lebanon is much more interesting. The United States of America and Turkey are now preparing Syria to address the Lebanon issue. For example, the Syrian armed forces are gradually moving toward the border with Lebanon, and right at the border, they suddenly started clearing minefields. Well, you might wonder why. Earlier, Donald Trump stated that it is Syria that can solve the Hezbollah problem in Lebanon, and that Israel can withdraw to its own territory. And the day before, Trump met again with Bashar, the president of Syria. But we'll talk about that when it actually happens. Let's return to the Persian Gulf countries. It seems that Qatar is becoming one of the key powers in the region. The Prime Minister of Qatar, Sheikh Mohammed bin Abdulrahman Al Thani, said in an interview with the Financial Times that the Middle East needs a new system of collective security that would include Iran. Here's a quote. Part of what we are doing now as countries in the region is creating a regional security system between us and Iran. We hope that in the future this will also lead to economic cooperation among all of us in order to bring stability back to the region. So, in fact, Qatar has started its negotiations with the aim of including Iran in the overall security system, but how Doha plans to achieve this is still unclear. However, this photo has been circulating online for several days now, and it prompts us to think about who actually pushed the United States of America toward an open war with Iran. In this photo, you can see the second-ranking figure in the American power hierarchy, or rather, the European one. The Vice President of the United States of America, J.D. Vance, is writing a memorandum of understanding with Iran, essentially under the dictation of the Qatari Prime Minister, Al Thani. Yes, in the photo is the same Al Thani who is now promising a new security architecture in the region which will include Iran. By the way, Al Thani described his attitude toward the current situation very well when commenting on the topic of the investment fund for Iran, worth $300 billion. He stated directly, and I quote, "The figure of $300 billion planned for the proposed investment fund in Iran is merely ambitious. But our goal is the prosperity of Iran and the growth of its economy, and our investments have always been and will always be based solely on commercial decisions. In other words, this is a purely pragmatic approach. We say, if we manage to reach an agreement with them, trade, develop the economy, and on top of that ensure security in the region, then that's just great. We will do everything we can to keep Iran within our sphere." At the same time, Turkey is entering the stage. The administration of US President Donald Trump intends to finally approve the sale of dozens of jet engines to Turkey worth hundreds of millions of dollars, despite objections from some members of the United States Congress. Reuters reports this, citing 4 sources familiar with the situation. The deal will be a gesture toward Ankara ahead of the NATO summit, which will take place in the Turkish capital next month. So, the engines produced by General Electric are intended for the first Turkish-made fighter jet of its own design, Khan. The project was launched back in 2016 as part of Ankara's efforts to strengthen its independence in the defense sector. According to one source, the value of the package exceeds $700 million. And in fact, this sale of engines will be a major breakthrough. It is noted that relations between Washington and Ankara remain generally warm under Trump. However, they are overshadowed by the long-standing dispute over Turkey's exclusion from the F-35 fighter program and the sanctions imposed after Turkey purchased Russian components. The S-400 system, which the US considers a threat to its security, and if you remember, this is a very old story. The Americans directly told Turkey, well, if you give up these S-400s, then you can participate in the F-35 program, including the production of these aircraft. Otherwise, it's very strange that on Turkish territory there would be both the most modern American F-35 fighter jet and the same S-400 air defense system from Russia, which is a direct enemy. And Recep Tayyip Erdogan resisted this for a long time. And yes, Recep Tayyip Erdogan resisted this for a long time. Answering a question about engines, the F-35 program, and plans for the NATO summit in Ankara, Trump said, "I will probably do something that will make them very happy." And now the representative of the largest Democratic faction in the House Foreign Affairs Committee, Gregory Meeks from New York, did not approve this deal. As part of an informal review, he accused the Trump administration of lacking good faith efforts to explain to Congress the consequences of the sale for bilateral relations and the issue of the S-400. Earlier, the US ambassador to Turkey, Tom Barrack, said that Ankara was preparing to give up the Russian S-400s, in fact, to cut them up for scrap metal and throw them away, in order to pave the way for themselves to purchase F-35 SE. And that these issues could be resolved within the next 4 to 6 months. If Turkey really does this, gets the F-35S and also engines for its most advanced fighter jets, then Turkey itself will be making claims to leadership in the Middle East region. That's why Recep Tayyip Erdogan has every chance to compete with Qatar for primacy and leadership in the region. But in conclusion of this episode, I want to point out one very important aspect that concerns the sanctions policy against Iran. For example, right now many experts are saying that it will be very, very difficult to unravel this tangle of sanctions against Iran. Even if Tehran receives multi-billion-dollar benefits from the announced 60-day easing of US sanctions, it will not be possible to completely lift the sanctions regime that has been in place for more than 40 years quickly. There are too many legal, political, and commercial aspects connected with these sanctions. And the key question is whether the framework agreement between the US and Iran will provide a sustainable economic effect, considering the complexity of lifting the sanctions regime, which covers US legislation, international measures at the UN Security Council level, and risks for the private sector. I'll just note that. Since 1979, when the Islamic regime was established in Tehran, the United Nations, the United States, and the European Union have imposed trade embargoes, frozen Iranian accounts, and used other restrictive measures to force Tehran to stop its nuclear program, human rights violations, and support for regional armed groups including Hamas, Hezbollah, the Yemeni Houthis, and Shiites in Iraq. And according to the 14-point Memorandum of Understanding signed on the eve of Donald Trump, Washington must begin lifting all these sanctions that have been imposed, I remind you, since 1979. And now Trump has 60 days, that is, until August 21 to lift these sanctions, otherwise there will be no full peace agreement. And the lifting of the remaining sanctions, even if it happens, will mean a significant shift in US policy in the Middle East, which for a long time has been aimed at containing Iran's influence and financially strangling the Ayatollah regime. This process will be very complicated because lifting some of the sanctions will require a decision by the executive branch. For others, permission from the US Congress will be required. Plus, close coordination with the UN and the countries that have imposed their own sanctions will be needed. For example, the European Union is already saying, Ayatollah, listen, you have treated us very badly, you have insulted us. So, we have separate sanctions that we imposed against Iran. We'll wait and see and think it over. Are we ready to lift them or not? Of course, you did well. You already promised Iran that the sanctions would be lifted, but will we actually lift them? Not necessarily. For example, in the future, will Iran be reconnected to the SWIFT system? That's a big question. Remember, SWIFT headquarters is in Europe, and without a decision from the European Council, no reconnection to SWIFT will ever happen. So, as you understand, it's a tangled web of sanctions. And it's not just about executive orders, but also about sanctions imposed not just by the US, not just by Congress, not just by lawmakers, but also at the UN level, at the European Union level, and even at the level of individual companies. Now, these companies need to be told that they can return to the Iranian market or that Iran can do business with them. Are companies ready to go along with all this? To return to the Iranian market or for Iran to interact with you? Are companies ready to go for all this? I'll leave it at that. Share your opinion and conclusions in the comments under this episode, subscribe to the channel, hit the bell, and don't forget to like. If you want to support the work of this YouTube channel, you can do so with any donation using the links and details in the description of this video. That's all for now. Take care of yourself. Goodbye, everyone.